Welcome back to another chapter of my journey. And in this section, I want to dive deep into the concept of absolute obedience, a virtue that was highly regarded in my upbringing, but one that left a lasting and troubling impact on my life. And I'll explore how this idea of blind faith and unquestioning devotion can lead even the most well meaning people to do absolutely horrific things in the name of faith. And I want to touch on how these teachings have completely undermined my ability to trust my instincts as I've navigated life as an adult. So, as a child, I was taught that absolute obedience was that highest form of virtue that one could attain. It was the idea that we should follow God's commands without question, trusting completely in whatever happened was part of His divine plan. And the stories I grew up with, the Abraham and Isaac, Noah's Ark, and Moses leading, the people out of Israel, were all people that obeyed without hesitation, even when the commands seemed incomprehensible or just plain cruel. And in these stories, obedience was not just encouraged, it was demanded. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his own son because God told him to. And Noah built an ark to save his family, knowing that the rest of the world would perish because this was God's will. And Moses led his people through the desert, performing miracles and issuing these divine commands, all in the name of God's authority. But here's the thing: absolute obedience, when taken to this extreme, is incredibly dangerous. It's easy to look at these biblical figures and admire their faith, but it's much harder to reckon with the fact that these stories also involved horrific acts carried out in the name of this faith. Abraham was ready to kill his own child. God flooded the entire world, killing everybody and sparing only a select few. And Moses presided over those plagues that absolutely devastated Egypt, leading to the deaths of countless people and even children. And as a child, I was taught that these acts were seen as just and righteous just because they were commanded by God. But even then, a part of me struggled with that disconnect between the idea of a loving God and the brutal, violent acts that were done in His name. And yet, questioning these teachings were not encouraged. They were discouraged, and they were either seen as signs of weak faith or plain out rebellion towards God's will. The concept of blind obedience, where you follow commands without question and suppress your own instincts, is a very slippery slope. The more you commit to it, the harder it becomes to pull yourself out. And the more you obey without questioning, the more you start to suppress the natural instincts that tell you when something isn't right. I was taught that blind faith was a virtue. Trusting God's plan, no matter how difficult it is. This was the ultimate sign of devotion. We were told that everything happens for a reason and that God's will is absolute. It's a comforting thought in some ways, this idea that there's a divine plan behind everything. But it's also incredibly dangerous because it can lead you to accept situations that instinctively you know are wrong. For example, my parents believed that God had called them into the ministry, and because of that, they refused to do regular jobs. We lived in poverty for a while, relying on donations to survive because they believed that this is what God wanted. We went without proper nutrition, living in a panic on end because my parents were convinced that they were following God's will. And instead of questioning this or finding other ways to support their family, they doubled down on their faith, believing that this suffering was a test or a sign of their devotion. And it's terrifying to think about how far people can go when they believe they're doing it in the name of God. This blind obedience strips away your ability to make rational, thoughtful decisions, and it encourages you to ignore your instincts, this gut feeling that tells you that something is wrong. And over time, this erodes your sense of self, leaving you as an empty shell of a person who can't distinguish right from wrong because you're so conditioned to obey without question. And from a very young age, I was taught that this obedience was something that I had to place value on and place it above all else. In my household and religious community, obedience wasn't just about following the rules. It was about surrendering your entire will to a higher authority, whether that's your parents or the church or God. There's no room for questioning, no doubt or second thoughts. To obey was to be righteous, and to disobey was to sin. But as I grew older, I started to feel a dissonance between what I was told to do and what I instinctively felt was right. There were moments when the commandments I was given seemed to come from a place of rigid authority rather than love and compassion. Yet, in a world where obedience was equated with goodness, I felt I had no choice but to comply, even when my entire being was resisting. I vividly remember moments where my gut screamed at me that something was wrong. Whether I was being told to shun someone who had fallen out of favor with the church, or being forced to participate in rituals that felt hollow and performative, I felt deep unease. But each time I tried to express those feelings, I was met with stern reprimands, or even worse, silent disappointment that I was allowing the devil to sow seeds of doubt in my mind. And the lesson was clear. My instincts were not to be trusted. They were seen as rebellious, sinful, and dangerous. And the more I internalized this message, the more I began to doubt myself. I learned to suppress those gut feelings, to ignore that inner voice that whispered that something wasn't right. And over time, I began I became so conditioned to equate obedience with safety that I stopped listening to myself altogether, and my own judgment became foreign to me. Something I had been trained to view with suspicion and mistrust. And so, as I transitioned from adulthood, the effects of this conditioning became so much more apparent. I found myself in situations where I struggled to make decisions. I was completely paralyzed by the fear that my instincts would lead me astray. I hesitated to trust others. I was always second guessing their motives and my reactions to them. But most damaging of all, I hesitated to trust myself. I questioned every choice, every feeling, every impulse, because I had been taught that my internal compass was fundamentally flawed. The result was a profound sense of disconnect, not just from others, but from my own identity. I honestly felt so lost, adrift in a sea of other people's expectations and demands, without any anchor to my true self. This constant self doubt made it so difficult to establish boundaries, to assert my needs, to pursue my dreams. I was so used to being told what to do, what to believe, how to feel, when to feel it, and that I completely lost the ability to navigate the world on my own terms. And it wasn't until I started the process of deconstructing my upbringing that I began to reclaim these instincts. This has been and it will continue to be a challenging journey. And learning to trust my inner voice again after years of being taught to silence it, it's honestly like learning to walk after years of being told that your legs are too weak to hold you up. So at first, I approached this reawakening with much trepidation, and each time I felt my gut reaction to something, I questioned it, scrutinized it, fearing that it might be leading me down the wrong path. But gradually, I started to see that my instincts weren't the enemy. They were actually a vital part of me, a source of wisdom and guidance that had been suppressed for so long. And I began to lean into these feelings, paying attention to the subtle cues that had once been drowned out by clamor of obedience. And the more I listened, the more I realized that my instincts were there to protect me, to guide me through life's complexities. They weren't rebellious or sinful, they were a fundamental part of my human experience. A tool that, when honed and trusted, could lead me a life where I was authentically myself. And this process of reclaiming my instincts has been both liberating and terrifying, obviously. It's like waking up after a long sleep, disorientated and unsure of what's real, but also so excited by the possibilities of finally seeing the world and myself clearly. And trusting my instincts again has meant learning to take risks, to embrace uncertainty, and to make decisions based on my own sense of what's right rather than what I've been told what is right. And with this trust comes a new sense of confidence, a belief that my ability to navigate life not as a passive follower, but as an active, proactive participant in my own story. It's a belief that I'm capable, that I have worth, and that my inner voice deserves to be heard. It's a belief that I can and should trust myself. So, reclaiming my instincts has had a profound impact on my relationships. I've learned to set boundaries, to say no when something doesn't feel right, to seek out connections that honor my true self rather than demand my compliance. I'm no longer content to be the obedient daughter, the compliant friend, or the unquestioning believer. I'm learning to be me fully and unapologetically. And this journey is far from over, like I said. There are still moments where I am so conditioned by the old ways that are pulling me into that self-doubt and mistrust. But each day I make the choice to listen to my instincts, to trust my ability to chart my own course. And with each choice, I move closer to reclaiming not just my instincts, but my whole self. So, the cost of blind obedience is not just about the damage that it does to your own self trust. It's also the relationships that you build or fail to build when obedience is a foundation. Again, my foundation with, again, my relationship with my parents, again, was entirely built of fear. I obeyed them because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. And as an adult, that dynamic has made it nearly impossible to have a healthy, respectful relationship with them. And like I've said previously, you can't spend 20 years building a relationship on fear and then suddenly expect mutual respect and understanding. And it's not just with my parents. The impact that that kind of upbringing seeps into every aspect of your life. Those fear-based relationships, whether they family or friends or even yourself, they don't foster that true connection. You don't allow for vulnerability or openness. Instead, you're locked in this cycle of compliance and repression, unable to truly express who you are and what you feel. And as a parent now, I'm acutely aware of the damage that blind obedience can do. I've worked hard to create a different kind of relationship with my kids, one that's based on trust, respect, and open communication. So, as I close this chapter, I want to emphasize the importance of trusting your instincts and questioning blind obedience. It's easy to fall into the trap of believing that faith means never questioning, never doubting, and never pushing back. But that's not faith, that's submission. True faith, true belief, should encourage growth, exploration, and the courage to stand up for what is right. If there's one takeaway, don't be afraid to trust your instincts. They are there for a reason. Your instincts are your inner compass, guiding you through life's complexities. When you're faced with situations that don't sit right with you, and that inner voice is your signal to pause, reflect, and ask the question. It's the voice that knows that something is off, even if you've been taught to silence it. And don't let blind obedience keep you from questioning the narratives that don't suit you. Build your life on a foundation of trust. Trust in yourself, trust in your ability to navigate the world, and trust that you have the strength to question and grow. Blind obedience can lead us down paths we would never choose if we were truly listening to ourselves. It can make us complicit in things that go against our deepest values and can cause us to betray our true selves in the process. But when you trust your instincts and allow yourself the freedom to question and explore, you claim your power. You begin to live a life that is true to who you are, not just what others expect of you. It's not easy to unlearn the patterns of blind obedience, especially when they've been ingrained in you from a young age. But every step you take towards trusting yourself is a step towards freedom. It's a step towards living a life that's not dictated by fear, but guided by your own sense of what is right and true. So as you move forward, I encourage you to listen to that inner voice. Don't be afraid to question, to doubt, and to explore. These are not signs of weak faith. They're not signs of rebellion. There are signs of a strong, evolving belief system that's truly your own. So thanks for joining me on my journey of discovering myself and reclaiming me. Till next time.